Hello, everyone. This second lesson in Plant Science 2 is where we look at how water moves through soil. And I think there's some interesting stuff in here for you today, so let's dig into it. I want to start off by reviewing some Plant Science 1 stuff, right? So what is the importance of water to plants? Well, plants are mostly water. That the majority of the material that's in them is water. Till you get to woody plants like trees and stuff like that. But it's a significant percentage of what plants are. And the main role, especially in herbaceous plants, is to provide what we call turgidity, right? That's where water pressure helps inflate a plant. By exerting pressure against the cell walls, it inflates the cell, and that's what holds the plant up. Obviously, once the plant has laid down wood, that's what supports the plant. But in herbaceous plants and fresh growth, it's water pressure. Also, transpiration, that's moving water into the roots out through the top of the plant. That's how we convey nutrients from the ground into the plant and help move sugar around. And of course, coming to sugar that's the main reason we have osmotic pressure. That's what moves water from areas of low water tension to high water tension, or what we call negative water tension. So the more negative it is, the more water is pulled in. So sugar creates like a real negative or a suction that draws the water in, and that's how the cells stay inflated. In soil, obviously this is where the plants are getting most of their water from. Some is through absorption in the leaves, but the vast majority is in from the roots. And when we start looking at soil and how it interacts with water, there's some forces at play that we need to understand. But looking at this picture here, we have soil particles, and we have our root and a root hair that's interacting with the soil. And the water is forming a film around all the soil particles. And it's this interface that we're most interested in when it comes to soil science and how the water behaves there. So looking at the slides here as we progress from left to right, this is basically at saturation times 0, where the soil is fully saturated with water and then allowed to drain out and subsequently dry down. And we want to look at more specifically what forces are involved in that. And here's the list of forces that we need to learn about for this course for completion. Starting with adhesion, then cohesion, capillary, and gravitational. Let's start with adhesion. So here we have a picture of a pine needle, and some raindrops are suspended on it, right? They're hanging on by what we call adhesion forces. That means to adhere or stick. So when we talk about adhesion forces, we're talking about water's natural attraction to a surface. This is related to the charge of the water molecules and the charge of the surface. So adhesion means to adhere. So if you get out your sticky tape, you're going to adhere that sticky tape to a surface. It's going to stick. When we look at cohesion, cohesion is where water sticks to itself. Co meaning together, right? Stick together. So these are two forces that we need to make sure we distinguish to. So adhere or adhesion is to a surface. Cohesion is water sticking to water. That's how we get these droplets forming, because the water sticks to the neighboring water molecules. He's got these little arrows depicting that. If you place water on a surface, it will adhere to the surface, right? But it will also adhere to itself, forming a droplet. And these nifty little caricatures of water are showing cohesion, where they attract to each other, and adhesion, where they stick to a surface. So as we go forward into this, keep that in mind, right? So adhesion would describe water adhering to soil particles, where cohesion would be water sticking to water that's in and amongst the soil. So taking these two forces and putting them together, we can understand capillary action a little better. So capillary action, best example would be you spill something in the kitchen, and you put some paper towel on, and the liquid wicks into the paper towel, and that is by capillary action. And in these tubes over here, we can demonstrate that where a wide tube doesn't draw water in very far, but the narrower the tube, the more the water is drawn in. And that's because of the adhesion forces of water to the inside surface of that tube allow the water to overcome some of the downward force of gravity. In this tube here, we can see that the water is able to climb quite a bit higher in the narrow tube versus the wide tube. Some of this is how we understood water moving into xylems in Plant Science 1, but we know that there's a lot more involved with moving water up a xylem. So in this, again, going back to these funny caricatures, in a wide tube, gravity pushes the water down, and on the sides it's able to climb up somewhat using adhesion forces. But when we get to a narrower tube, gravity is weaker, and so the water can climb up the sides using adhesion and achieve a higher climbing height, like over here. So that's just to show that adhesion forces can be substantial in that they can fight gravity. So capillary action is when we want to wick water into or around soil. And a lot of times in horticulture, we look at watering pots from below, right? So sub-irrigating a pot, or say you've got your grandma's favorite African violet and she doesn't like it being top watered because it might cause crown rot, and she insists that you place it in a saucer of water, right? And there's your pot, and of course the water wicks into the soil through capillary action. So some soils, like clay soils, which have tighter spaces, have higher capillary action, versus loose soils, like sandy soils, have low capillary action. So sandy soils, the water drains, but it also won't wick up very well, where clay soils will wick the moisture throughout the soil volume much more quickly. Lastly, I want to look at gravity. Gravitational forces in soil are important. So the biggest thing, of course, is after you fully saturate the soil, the water is sitting heavily in all those pores and gravity starts to pull the water out. Okay, so the idea is that the weight of the water has a downward force and it pulls the water down out of the soil. And it's acting against the adhesion and cohesion forces within the soil. So they're holding it in. Once all the free water has drained out the bottom, we call that gravitational water. So gravity has pulled the water out. So in soil, we want to think of it as a tug of war, right? We've got adhesion forces and we've got cohesion forces holding the soil in the water in the soil. And then we have gravitational forces that are pulling the water deeper into the soil or out the bottom of your pot. So in today's lab, when we work with the sponges, and you'll see my video of me demonstrating it, you'll see how gravitational forces are pulling the water out of the sponge, but the tight spaces in the sponges are holding the water into the sponge. And so the water drains out of a saturated sponge up into the point where these two forces are equal. A tug of war, and then there's no longer any draining happening, right? So there's this analogy of a tug of war. In the one hand, we've got gravitational, and the other we have adhesion and cohesion. And once they're equal, the water stays put. Now, looking closer at soil particles, there's some interesting forces involved. The excess water, this is the water that freely drains from the soil. We call that gravitational water. Sits further away from the soil particles. And then there's a region closer to the soil particle, which is your area of cohesion. This is where water is sticking to water. That's reasonably tightly held, but roots can access this water. It's not like it's held really, really tightly. And then there's the adhesion layer. The adhesion layer is held incredibly tightly. These units are called bar, but to put it in perspective, negative 10,000 bar, this is how tightly water is suctioned to the surface of a soil particle. Negative 10,000 bar is equivalent to 145,000 psi. So your typical car tire is maybe 45 pounds per square inch, or PSI. Your typical bike tire anywhere from 50 to 80 PSI. That's a fair amount of pressure. But the adhesion forces in soil are up to 145,000 psi, and that's a negative pressure. So basically, adhesion water is not available to plants. They cannot access that. The only way we can remove that is by putting soil into an oven and drying it at a high temperature to remove that water. So for the most part, what we see as dry soil probably still has water in it, but the plants can't access that. So plants can access up into the cohesion layer. After that, it's no more. So here's my tire analogy showing where roots and water are able to access up to negative 15 bar. As your household vacuum is around negative 0.002 bars. So roots are still pretty darn good at getting water off soil down to negative 15 bar. All right. So, some review questions. Which of the following forces is responsible for causing water to stick to a surface? Wait for it, and it is adhesion. All right. This force causes water to squeeze into tight spaces. Now, technically, it's a combination, right? Capillary, but you could also argue that these two independently or together collectively are the same, right? But all right, more terminology related to what we were just talking about. So looking at soil, we'll talk about saturation and field capacity. So this picture you've already seen before. Saturation is right after you've fully watered your pot and it's nicely soaked through and water's draining out the bottom, and then you stop irrigating it. And then it continues to drain. And after it's done draining, we've drained all the gravitational water out. It is at field capacity. So in your experiment where you're working with, and again, I'll demonstrate this, you can try it at home, where I have a pot of soil, we're going to add water until the pot is completely saturated right to the top. And that gives us a measurement of all the spaces that are between all the soil particles, the total volume that is not soil. Okay? Then, when we let the water drain, we remove the bottom, we let it drain out, and we collect that volume, right? That tells us how much gravitational water has been removed from the soil. All these spaces where water was when it was saturated is now empty, right? And it's sitting in our pan over here. And that gives us, when we measure that volume, it tells us how much air space is in our soil at field capacity. So that's how much soil, how much water the soil can hold, and how much air by subtraction is there. Obviously, once the water's let dry down to the wilting point, that's when the water that's left is no longer available to the roots. So I need you to know the differences, between field capacity and saturation. And that's what that lab experiment, which you'll be looking at in the folder later, will help to clarify for you, hopefully. So, again, saturation, all the water that can fit into soil before gravity drains the excess out. Remember these for your quizzes and midterm. So water occupies all empty spaces in the soil. That's saturation. Field capacity is what's left after gravitational water, or gravity, has drained excess water from the soil. So what I say, gravitational water is removed. Okay? Again, here's another depiction. I know repetition, but I want to make sure you get this. So we saturate our soil, then we let it drain, and we have our field capacity. And if you wanted to know what your field capacity is, you measure how much you measured for saturation to occur, and then you measure how much drained out, and you subtract, and that's your field capacity. Unavailable water, that's adhesion water, held very tightly. This is what we call the wilting point. So remember the wilting point. This is right when we get to the point where it's only adhesion water present, not cohesion water. So plants can access free water and cohesion water, but not adhesion water. All right, so some questions here. Field capacity for water in soil is A, the amount of water remaining in soil after draining from saturation. B, the amount of water that remains in soil at saturation. C, the amount of water in soil at the wilting point. And D, the amount of water in soil that is unavailable to plants. All right, and the correct answer, of course, is A, the amount of water remaining after draining from saturation. Temporary wilting point. So that's not the permanent, this is temporary. This is where water is becoming limiting. At this point, it's important to know that plants can recover. Plant water use at this point could be just greater than what the roots can supply. So a hot, dry day, a cucumber plant can wilt, as you see in the picture, where the roots can't supply enough water to keep up with the evaporation rate of the plant. Oftentimes you'll see, well, not often, but you might run into a situation where you see some plants in a greenhouse, for example, near the end of the day, and they're starting to wilt. And the temptation is to water them. I would encourage you to wait till the next day. First of all, as the sun goes down, the temperature in the greenhouse cools and the relative humidity typically climbs. And that will stop transpiration rates from the plant, and they often will recover. And when you come back in the morning, that's a better time to water, so you're not going to get disease, fungal infections and stuff. A lot of plants will recover through the night, so don't panic and wait till the morning so you don't get disease. Permanent wilting point, plants can't recover. There will be no recovering at this point. Some plants recover from wilting better than others. Like poinsettias are not very good at recovering from wilting. Hydrangeas are not very good. If they're in bloom, their blooms often are permanently damaged if they're allowed to wilt. So not all plants wilt gracefully and recover gracefully. But anyway, so typically this is where the pull of the roots is not great enough to keep up with the water that's being evaporated from the plant. And at this point, no amount of water is going to fix your plant. So sub-irrigation, I mentioned this when we talked about capillary action. This is a concrete flood floor, and water comes up through these grates, and it soaks into the bottom of the pots, irrigating the crops from below. This is a great way to get uniform irrigation. And also for crops that don't like water on the leaves, it can cut down on disease. Or if your crop's flowering, you don't have to worry about getting water on the blooms, which can cause botrytis. So sub-irrigation is a fantastic thing. It's expensive. You have to pour all this concrete. But it does actually allow you to move equipment in here to pick up and place plants very quickly. So in greenhouses, we like to do a lot of sub-irrigation. There are also fancy irrigation pots where you can have a tube. Sometimes you see these in shopping malls where there's specimen trees where they water down a tube to irrigate from the bottom up. Again, to cut down on disease, or more likely to not get water on the floor where someone can slip and sue the mall owner. There's also tabletop sub-irrigation where the table floods or it drains in one direction and slowly irrigates a crop from below. Obviously, this is a video and you can't click on this link, but if you go to the slide-only version of this, I encourage you to click on this video link and watch this video. It's very important. It talks about infiltration rates with the different soil types. Now, last class we discussed this, but obviously these are all coming together, right? So clay soil, because they're so tightly packed and the particles are so small, water cannot percolate through. So there's a very slow infiltration rate. Whereas in sand, there's a rapid infiltration rate. Watch the video and be sure to follow that. What's also interesting about this is that because of capillary action in clay soils, let me clean this up. In clay soils, you also get movement left to right. The water wicks through capillary action sideways. Where in sandy soils, where there's bigger spaces, less capillary action, the water tends to move straight down in a more vertical plume. That's important to keep in mind when you're irrigating crops. Because this gravitational force dominates you may or may not need more than one dripper in a pot to get uniform irrigation. Whereas if you have more of a loamy soil, the water can capillary action spread out and irrigate and wet more of the soil. So again, in clay, capillary forces dominate and the water moves not just down, but left and right. Here's a picture of a plume, right? So in a clay soil, the irrigation plume is broader. You can get away with just one dripper, for example, for a plant. Where in sandy soils, you might need multiple drippers because the water's gravitational force is pulling it down quicker than it can spread sideways. This is a real interesting section of this lesson, and I really encourage you to watch this video. It's from the same group that did the infiltration videos, and I have a link under the class folder for this as well, so be sure to watch that video. But let me explain this, what a textural boundary is, and maybe I can debunk a myth that you've heard. So when you have a sharp boundary, right, so that means there's an abrupt change in textural layers, okay? That means we go from, say, a fine soil, a loamy soil, okay, to a coarse sand layer. We create what's called a perched water table. And the classic is a clay or heavy loam over sand. In a situation here, the sand actually percolates full by capillary action and gravitational action, and saturates completely with water. And the water, once it's fully saturated, encounters this textural boundary. And the adhesion forces to the clay are strong enough to keep the water in this layer and not let it pass into the next layer. So you end up with this layer of moist soil perched over top a sandy layer. Now, this is a manufacturing technique used in golf greens to ensure that when you apply water from the outside, that it evenly irrigates the entire green. And also, if you have a huge rainstorm and lots of water lands on your golf green, it will accommodate the excess water to a point, and when this is fully saturated, then the water moves into the lower layer and it drains away from the green. So it sort of acts as a check valve, this textural boundary layer. And where have we seen this before, and where does the myth come from? That's coming up in the next slide. Textural layer, here we are. So there's our root zone. Okay, there's our gravel bed and our drainage tube. And this golf green, this water will stay in here until it's absolutely fully saturated, and then the gravitational forces pull it into the coarse layer where it drains away. Again, it's a perched water table. Another picture showing you a green. All right, so here's my question. Does it make sense to put gravel at the bottom of a pot, right? So we just discussed textural boundary layers. And I'm talking about putting gravel at the bottom of a pot. Okay, so if we think about it as like a golf green, you've got your irrigation coming in from the top. You're saturating your soil. The water is percolating down, saturating, and then it encounters a textural boundary layer, coarse gravel, just below your soil. What ends up happening is the water will move sideways because adhesion and cohesion forces will keep it in the layer until your soil is so saturated that it cannot contain it anymore, and only then will it drain into the gravel. Now, what that effectively means is that the zone of saturation, which I would call the bottom area where gravitational water and capillary action are equal, is higher, closer to the roots than when there's no gravel in the pot. And so if you're putting gravel in the bottom of your pot, you're probably assuming your plant is sensitive to excess moisture. What you're doing is you're pushing that zone of saturation into and closer to your roots. You're actually more likely to have root diseases in this type of a pot configuration than you would had you not put gravel, because the saturation zone would be down lower away from your roots. Now, there's still a hole in the pot, so when there's excess water in your pot, you can't contain it anymore, it drains, right? So let's keep that in mind. Some of these things that practices that people do are actually not founded in proper soil science. So next time you think you're going to throw a bunch of rocks in the bottom of your pot, don't do it. The only time it might actually make sense would be to throw a brick down there if your pot's blowing away all the time from your garage. So that's a quicker lesson compared to last week, which was a marathon. I'm sorry about that. There is another video in the lab, and pay attention that there's a quiz this coming weekend. My quizzes open every Friday at 5 p.m. and close every Sunday at 1 minute before midnight. That's an easy setting on Blackboard. So you have the entire weekend to do a quiz. They're all under the assignments tab on Blackboard. The quiz will generate an announcement once it opens at 5 p.m. Try to keep on top of these quizzes. All right, I'll talk to you in the lab videos next.